move on to this poll, I'm wondering how much of a problem it is for the European governments in trying to retain or preserve this deal, because European governments themselves might say, look, we want to keep this deal, we're going to do everything in our power to keep this deal, but it's private European companies that are investing in Iran, and European governments, of course, are in no position to dictate to a private company where you can and cannot put your money, right?
Yes. Before I answer that, though, I'd just like to respond to an accusation made that I personally or other people on this panel are somehow on Iran's side. I wouldn't put it that way, and I don't think the Europeans are either. I think that they're on the side of sensitive diplomacy and negotiation. I mean, there are obvious problems here in a very volatile region, bristling with tensions. Never has it been more dangerous than it is today. And what's needed is a thoughtful diplomacy, not what Trump is doing, which is going in the absolute opposite direction, acting unilaterally with an unthought-out policy that overwhelmingly West experts think is very dangerous. So it's the diplomacy and the negotiation that it's important, I think, and this is what the Europeans are going to do. As for the European companies, I think that the governments have a lot to say about what those companies are doing. I don't think that should the secondary sanctions actually be put in place, we're not sure that they will, but if they are, how much they are going to hurt these companies. I think that the private sector enterprises in Europe will go along with the government rather than acting emotionally and pulling anything out. Those investments that they've got in those countries, have roots, and it's going to be a lot of work to pull them out. So I actually think that there's not a big problem there.
So if I could just quickly, just very quickly to that point, there's always tremendous rhetoric that flies around, especially now with 24/7 media, advent of Twitter and social media and like, that everyone is threatening to do this, do that. Companies are going to go here, pull out of here, do this and do that. I have a strong hunch that after all is said and done, and when the dust settles, if the dust settles, hopefully it does settle soon, then you'll see that very few companies or even nation states will violate the U.S. point of view on this, because the benefits are just too high. It's not ideological, it's not political, it's just pragmatic. And I just feel like to make a choice and risk sanctions from the United States isn't going to be worth it for the small amount of benefit they might get, or from a rhetorical or point of view, or some guests going on a TV show like this or someone else to bash the president and call him capricious and all these things. In the end, companies are going to do what's best for their shareholders.
Victor Gao, do you buy that? Are Chinese companies going to risk a confrontation with the United States? Are they going to pull out of this deal?
I don't think people will want to accept the bullying by the United States. I think even if the United States can get away with this situation vis-à-vis the Iran nuclear issue, the rest of the world will no longer trust the United States, and the U.S. leadership will eventually elapse into ruins. And this is the philosophical damage to the United States in the longer term. Don't expect that you can violate an international deal without bad consequences. Don't believe your allies will always have to stand by you in a situation like this. And I think this is the first time that your close allies of the United States stand up in rebellion against the United States leadership. And this shows to the rest of the world that the United States is really by itself in violating its international obligations, in violating a signed up international deal like this. And this really sets a bad example. The United States is not a banana republic. The United States cannot afford to be looked upon as a country without dignity, without decency, without trustworthiness, and without predictability. This is bad for the United States. For China, China definitely will stand by its principle. The Chinese companies are continuing doing business with Iran, and I don't think the U.S. pressure will put a deterrence on the Chinese companies doing business with the Iranian counterpart.
All right. Morgan, besides the fact that, as you pointed out, President Trump is actually implementing a campaign promise here, is it, as Victor Gao just pointed out, a question of trust?
Well, why don't you just trust the American president to do what he said he would do? To me, the whole point of this shows that in both parties in America, the left and the right, the Republican Democrats, we've all gotten so accustomed to basically making false promises that we don't really expect anymore presidents to follow through on things they say. Yeah. If anything, this shows how unusual, good or bad, depending on where you sit on the issue of President Trump, he follows through on things he's done. And I think it's just funny to me that your last guest, the gentleman, the very thoughtful gentleman in China, said this shows unpredictability. But for over a year and a half of campaigning and a year into his presidency, he said he was going to do this. And then he did it. That strikes me as the most predictable thing possible.
Yeah, that's right. He has called us the worst deal ever.
He said he would tear it up on day one of his presidency, and he took longer than that.
Right, but what does President Trump want from the Iranians? What is he going to replace this with?
Well, I don't know if it's directly replacement from one thing to the other.
Yeah.
What we talked about many times, not just you and I, but I mean folks in the Talking Heads class, is that the United States under the Obama years made a tactical decision, for whatever reason, I can't be in the former president's heart and mind, but he moved America much more towards Iran. This president has shifted the American strategic objective away from Iran and towards Saudi Arabia. These two being basically the biggest players in sort of the Middle East and sort of the dominant worldview from the point of view of the Middle East. So this is reflective, I think, of that as well. So, you know, Iran, listen, people here may disagree with me. I believe Iran is a terrible actor. They murder homosexuals. They oppress women. They are the biggest, according to the American list, the biggest sponsor of terrorism around the world.
Saudi Arabia does some of that as well.
It's fair enough. I'm just telling you from our point of view, from the American point of view, where we're sitting here today, that's the point of view. So America has made a choice to move farther away from that and more towards this other side. Someone like myself wouldn't say they're good guys. I'm not trying to say Saudi Arabia is some shining beacon of openness for human rights. I'm just simply saying that it's reflective of a bigger point that America, Israel, Saudi Arabia, some of the other Gulf countries are sort of developing this coalition or bloc, and countries like Turkey, Iran, Russia, and China is a bit of in between, are sort of seeming to ideologically move away from them on certain issues. The trade thing is going to be interesting to be seen, and that's what we'll see play out, is how this international trade relationship will work itself out if and when and if JCPOA finally completely dies.
Okay, Ambassador Mousavian, what is your view on that? Are we seeing what is happening now as part of a broader dynamic in international relations, that President Obama, as Morgan just pointed out, moved closer, or rather engaged more with Iran, and we have President Trump now, who is engaging more with Saudi Arabia at Iran's expense?
You know, I think the best is what President Trump himself said publicly. He publicly said the GCC countries, meaning Saudi Arabia, Emirate, they don't have nothing other than money. He said publicly, officially. And then officially also he said, the U.S. has spent $7 trillion during last years, and they have received nothing. Now he asked GCC to pay the money back. Therefore, this is what President Trump has made it official, that they have paid $7 trillion, and GCC countries, they don't have anything other than money, and they should pay this money back. Therefore, I think President Trump knows what he is doing. He is using Iranian issue just as instrument to milk the GCC countries to get some trillions of dollars back, selling weapons and so and so. On terrorism, my friend in Berlin knows better than me, based on United Nations Security Council resolution, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they are threat number 1 of terrorism in the world, and everyone recognizes Iran has fought seriously ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria. And again, my friend knows better than me that the biggest dilemma of terrorism today was the fact 100,000 terrorists from all over the world, from Europe, from the US, from Saudi Arabia, Yemen, they were organized. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of money, billions were provided them, and weapons. And we all know which countries provided money and weapons for ISIS, Daesh, to send 100,000 terrorist groups to Syria. Therefore, blaming Iran on the US accusation is totally baseless.
Yeah, I want to get back to Paul. Paul, there is going to come a time very soon when the Europeans are going to have to make some very cold, hard calculations. Question is, how important is Iran for European investors, for German investors? At some point, is Germany going to do, or German investors rather, going to do some kind of cost-benefit analysis and come to the conclusion that the investment in Iran is too small, rather than we risk a confrontation with the United States?
I don't think this is really a situation where the finances and the economics come first. We're in a very, very dangerous situation. I think the region it will be heading towards putting the region on a course of war. And it almost seems to me like the Trump government and Israel are spoiling for war. That's what they want. Which brings me around to something that's been said a number of times, that this is an unprecedented break between the Europeans and their staunch ally, the United States. Actually, it's not. I mean, if you remember in 2003, many of the European countries didn't support President Bush's idea to invade Iraq. And then also it was a point of an American president claiming something that wasn't the case, that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. Weapons of mass destruction, excuse me. It was not the case. The regime change that followed started 10 years of war with thousands of lives lost at an enormous cost. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, these are all examples of attempted and failed regime change designed. The architects are the same people now who are in the Bush government, former neocons like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. It didn't work before. It's not going to work this time either.
Okay. Victor, are we going to see some kind of Chinese diplomatic offensive here, some kind of initiative from Beijing to save this deal?
Now, first of all, I think the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit will take place very soon in Qingdao in China. Iran is an observer state. I would not be surprised if the Iran nuclear deal will be raised and discussed at the SCO summit meeting. Further, the Iranian president, who is coming to join the SCO summit, will also pay a separate state visit to China. And during the meeting, he will meet with Chinese president and other leaders for official discussion about China-Iranian issues. And I would not be surprised if the Iranian nuclear deal will again be discussed. China will do its diplomacy with all the other major powers signatory to this deal, and China will continue to urge the United States to do the right thing rather than adding fuel to fire in the Middle East.
Okay, Morgan, very quickly. Sure. I've only got 10 seconds. How big is the risk of war?
It's much smaller than I think the guest here would lead you to believe. This president does not want war. And the other gentleman forgot to mention that during Libya, it was under Obama, when a lot of the American allies didn't support the effort as well. Okay. This president is not overly aggressive on unilateral action at all. Believe me, it's not.
Okay.
It's not.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Well, that's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America. Or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.